tell me what to do to make all my Lunker Lake dreams come true.
Hello everybody, Bob Lusk coming at you live. Wasn't quite sure if I was going to do that, but I think we should. So let's have a little bit of fun. Now, if I can just turn that music off, you guys know the drill. Hell, I've only been doing this 5 years. You'd think I know how to do it by now. But hey, glad to join up with you folks tonight. Hope we can have a little bit of fun. I just decided to do this just a few hours ago. You know, I said I was going to do it once a month, which I'm still going to do it once a month. You know, but I was hoping to have some of the podcasts in the can by now, but I don't. So it's going to take a little bit longer to get those done than what I like. But, you know, here we go. We'll see. So bring your questions and let's talk about ponds and lakes and stuff. I've gotten 3 different emails in the last, 10 days or so. You know, when we had that really hard cold snap that just scoured across the nation from the Arctic Circle. You know, we got a New Year's blast right after Christmas. And here in Texas, I mean, we didn't get above freezing for like 2 days or something, which I'm not ever going to whine about that because a lot of you guys get to see it way, way more than we do. But anyway, it had some impact on ponds, so I thought I'd talk about that for a few minutes. So let's give it a whirl. Bring your questions. Hello, Jay Spires. Happy New Year, brother. Alexander Cohen, hey, you're welcome. Glad to do it. Troy Todd, Kirk McGlamory, good to see you, buddy. There's Jeremy Day checking in. I get to visit with Jeremy Day pretty often. He's working on a project down in the Houston area. So, hey, you know the drill. Hashtag Pond Boss Magazine in the comment section. Click like or love. That's what Debbie told me. And share this to your timeline, and you're eligible for a drawing for a Pond Boss hat. And whatever else that Leanne's got in the cupboard up there at Pond Boss World Headquarters. So, Todd Austin, you got the deal. Hello, John Henry. Let's do this. So, anyway, I've gotten several emails from guys. Let's see, Indiana, Missouri, Louisiana, and Kentucky. Jim, who watches this show all the time, he emailed me with some pictures here a few weeks ago. So what it looks like to me, and you know, and I could stand to be wrong, but I'm going to tell you what I think. Whenever we see a really hard cold snap just roar down out of the Arctic Circle coming over from Siberia or wherever it comes from, and sends our temperatures plummeting, water temperatures, especially in smaller bodies of water that are fairly shallow, small meaning less than 100 acres, if the water's shallow, when that wind sweeps across it and that cold front comes down hot and heavy and fast and frigid, and your water temperatures can drop as much as 10 to 15 degrees in 24 to 36 hours. When that happens, what you'll see is fish don't like that. And what really makes it worse is when the temperature goes down, sits there for a few days, and then runs right back up. That is a perfect combination for fish diseases like ICH, you can look that one up. It's also stressful. You know, it's kind of like, I've told this story before where, like my 90-year-old granddad, well, in my case, it'd be my 90-year-old dad, if I had a 90-year-old dad, if he went out to check the mail and it was 12 degrees outside and he walked down to the mailbox 400 yards away, got the mail and came back, and Mom said, "Dad, why didn't you wear any clothes in the mailbox?" Well, he didn't think about it, you know. And so then he gets sick. And then things begin to deteriorate. And a month later, he dies. And the death certificate says that he died of pneumonia or whatever it is. That ain't what killed him. What killed him was the trip to the mailbox without any clothes on. You know, so where I'm going, that parallel story is about with fish. Fish being cold-blooded, they don't like it cold, and they don't often like it hot. You know, like today here in Texas, I'm in Granbury here in my studio at my house. The temperature here today was 85 degrees. It broke a record, 85 degrees. And 10 days, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was 8. You know, so there's almost an 80-degree swing in the temperature. I guarantee these ponds and lakes, when they drop that 15, 18, 20 degrees, whatever it is, and then they shoot back up 10 or 12 degrees, that's really, really hard on fish. And so if, and you probably remember back in the fall, one of the things I preached was to be sure that your fish were in good shape going into the winter. If you culled your bass, if you made sure the forage fish numbers were up, if you fed your fish well to make sure they were healthy coming into the winter, those aren't the fish that are going to perish in situations like this. It's going to be the fish that are not in the best shape. It's going to be the weakest ones of the batch. So I was sent pictures of bluegills, several pictures of bluegills, pictures of gizzard, shad, and even a couple of bass. So my opinion is that some of those fish were weakened by the temperature fluctuations. Something happened to them, like one of the pictures I saw today from Indiana, that was a big bluegill, about 1.5 pounds, that was up in shallow water, kind of lethargic and couldn't move very good and was sick. So, but he took it, and it was Ian Swanger that sent me the email. He took it out to deeper water and released it, and it swam off. But when I looked at that fish, and I'm going to put that fish in Ask the Boss in the March-April issue of Pond Boss. So you guys be looking for that when you get your issue of the magazine. Speaking of the magazine, here it is right here. Pond Boss Magazine, $35 a year, cheaper than a Friday night date, and it lasts a year. You can subscribe to it at pondboss.com. But in the March-April, I'm going to show pictures of that fish. The fish looked bloated to me. It looked like a fish that was full of eggs, or even bigger than that. Its belly just looked bloated to me. And sometimes this time of year in more southern climates, if people are feeding the fish, it's common for those fish to not digest that food real quick. And when that happens, then it absorbs water because it's typically dry when they eat it, and then gases begin to form if they don't digest it fast enough. So I've seen that as an issue before. So let's see, I got several topics, but it looks like Gary Elburn's in the house. Alexander Cohen says, do you think 10-pound plus largemouth bass prefer one forage versus another when abundant? Threadfin, gizzard, shad, bluegill, crappie, crawfish, and most recently I discovered big golden shiner. That's a great question. I'll tell you what 10-pound plus bass want is 2-pound plus meals. That's what they'd rather have. If they could eat a 2-pound gizzard shad, they're gonna expend the energy to catch that shad before they're gonna go try to chase a school of threadfin shad. So, for example, threadfin shad, they're schooling fish. They don't get much bigger than about 6 inches long, maybe 7, close to 7, but 5 to 7 inches is about tops for threadfin shad. They run in big schools. They're typically in open water, filter feeding, where gizzard shad get to be 2 pounds apiece, 1.5 pounds, 1.25 pounds. So those bass are gonna want bigger bait, bigger food sources, which means that they'll eat a 1-pound bass before they'll try to chase a 3-inch bluegill. Now they'll also eat, pretty good sized bluegill, 7 to 9 inch bluegill. Now they'll try to choke down a 10-inch bluegill or 11-inch bluegill. They struggle with that, even a 10-pound bass. But here's the thing about a 10-pound bass. It didn't get there by being lazy and shy. It got there by being assertive, aggressive, and figuring out, so to speak, figuratively speaking, how to make a living in that environment. So odds are high that once a bass hits that size, they're not going to have any trouble eating what they want. I can't tell you how many times. Here's a cool thing. It's whenever I'm out in my electrofishing boat, especially in the springtime, it's very common to shock up a double-digit bass in shallow areas where the bottom of the pond or lake is muddy and it's packed full of gizzard shad. Those bass will be chasing those big gizzard shad. So if I were going to go fishing in a big lake in the next few weeks, few months, I would be looking for shallow water once the temperature's in the upper 50s, lower 60s, where I expect gizzard shad live. So gizzard shad love muddy water. They're bottom feeders. So they're going to be in shallow, muddy water, and those big bass are going to go chase them up there. So it's a little bit more than that answer than what you were looking for, but that's the way we go. That's the way we roll. Let's see what we got here. Mike Foranash. Jay Spires, I think I said hi to Jay. Gary Elborn, Mike Cottrell, Palo Pinto, Texas. Christy Berg checking in from Kansas. Ron Ardoin just turned 50. He's starting to look bloated. Hey man, it's because of all that jambalaya, crawfish pie, all that good Cajun food. You make some really, really good stuff. And you know what? Wait till you hit 60. Or hell, wait till you hit 67. Want to feel bloated? Cheers to bloat. Jeremy Day was reading about freshwater shrimp. Thoughts? I have several thoughts about freshwater shrimp. First of all, where you live in Montgomery County, Texas, just north of Houston, there are freshwater shrimp that are native there. And if you can get some of those, I love those. I mean, when I was in college, I didn't even know they existed until I got to go out on a field trip in an ecology class of all things, and we started seining ditches after a flood and kept catching these little bitty grass shrimp about that big. And some of them, their tails were covered in little green specks. Well, those were eggs. Every lake I've ever found where those things can thrive, they really add value to the ecosystem, and they add value to the food chain. Now, they can't be a primary source of food by any stretch, but they can sure be a good way to diversify the food chain. But now, one of the secrets to fisheries management in shrimp, this really jumps out to me about talking about shrimp, is if you don't provide the right kind of habitat, the healthy kind of water that animal needs, and the food chain, they're not going to thrive. But if you can do those things, they're going to do really, really well. So freshwater shrimp are great. Now, there's a guy in Weatherford that grows Macrobrachium rosenbergi. water. Bourbon and water. I started not to do the bourbon, but it's Wednesday. He raises Macrobrachium rosenbergi. That's Australian prawns. And he's gotten some pretty good publicity and some really good results using his freshwater shrimp through some of the fisheries biologists around the nation to stock them in lakes that have bass in it. Now, in order to do that, you got to have the right kind of habitat, which, like bushy pondweed, American pondweed, massive aquatic plants. If you can release these shrimp into aquatic plants, when you buy them, they're not very big, a third to a half an inch long. So they're not big at all, but they're not that expensive. They're like 15 cents a piece or something, 16 cents a piece. I don't know. They're not that expensive, and freight's not that expensive. Yep, and Kirk McGlammer, he's talking about the owner of La Perla. That's exactly right. He used prawns, but what he did was he would grow them out in his hatchery ponds and then pull the gate on a 12-inch pipe and flush them all into the lake at the same time and raise two crops of those prawns every year. Well, the guy that he buys his prawns from are west of Fort Worth, Texas. So they're kind of an intriguing, novel, interesting animal to use if you don't mind spending the dollars and you've got what they need to be supported. One of the things that I was a little bit in a quandary about was if you release all these little bitty shrimp that you're paying 15 cents a piece for that probably weigh $2,000 per pound, so you're paying like $300 a pound or whatever that is. If they don't get the chance to grow up and become significant to where they're more like 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 per pound, then it's the cost versus benefit isn't worth it. But if you've got what they need, then it is worth it. And if you've got what grass shrimp need, then they can be worth it as well. So there's all kinds of native shrimp in different parts of the United States. In the Midwest, there's scuds. And I think if you research for your area and find something like that, that can be an added value benefit to your fish management. Yep, okay, Jeremy Day, as far as forage for bass bluegill. Yep, got it, okay. Let's see here. Holy cow, this thing's kind of scrolling fast. Yep, Kirk Glamour, yep. Okay, so I talked about that. So, let's see here. What do we got going on? Looks like we got 27 people on board watching. 23 comments. Okay, so I need more comments, guys, so bring something to me. The other thing I was going to talk about was I got a electronic newsletter today from an aeration company, Outdoor Water Solutions. Good friends of mine, John and Tanya and their team. They got wind-driven and solar-powered aeration, and they've diversified into the market to compete with some of the other aeration companies like Vertex and, Keaton, folks like that. So the statement that they made in their article was that they think it's a good idea to aerate ponds in the wintertime. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that. And the purpose for aeration is to move water so that it can contact the atmosphere and exchange gases. So when there's something organic in your pond, it's got to compost. Well, it's got to have oxygen to do that efficiently. And what aeration does is it allows the water to move vertically to match with the horizontal currents in a pond, so more volumes of water can be upwelled and contact the atmosphere, so it can relieve itself of its gases, which are the byproducts of that composting or decomposing organic matter, and then accept oxygen, into the water and dissolve that so that whatever needs to breathe it, use it, bacteria consume it, fish breathe it, can do that. So now, here's where my conflict comes in. As the water temperature drops, its affinity for oxygen goes up, so it can hold more oxygen. Then with all these different animals in there that are cold-blooded, their metabolism rates drop, which means their oxygen demand drops. And so when that happens, they don't consume as much oxygen from the water. So when you're aerating a pond in the northern tiers of states, then you're going to be taking and opening up holes in the ice where that water can be pushed from the bottom to the top and contact those sub-zero temperatures. Well, that means that water is going to get really, really, really cold. Now, if it's 32 degrees, it's going to be ice. I remember somebody asking me about super cooled water before. I don't think I've ever seen water below 32 degrees that wasn't ice. So I don't know what super cooled means, but I know this. If the water temperature is 32.2, fish don't like it. And if you leave the ice cap on top of a pond, then the temperature of the water down in deeper depths is going to be 39 or 40 degrees, and that is a huge difference. Just imagine you going out where it's 32 degrees compared to 10 degrees. Huge difference, even though it's a 20 degree difference, 22 degree difference. So I don't see, and another thing is when the water temperature drops, the bacterial colonies can't do nearly the job that they do when the water is warm because it's too cold for them. So they're not going to decompose all that organic waste in the wintertime like they'll do in the spring and the summer and the fall. So I think it's less relevant to aerate in the wintertime than in the summertime for those two reasons. You're not going to expedite cleansing of the water. That should have been done in the spring, summer, and the fall. And you're not going to add a lot more oxygen to the water unless you're subject to winter kill. And that's a whole nother story. Now, which that's a big problem in the northern states. So if your ponds are subject to winter kill, then yeah, it's a good idea to aerate, but don't aerate the deeper water. Bring it up into the shallower water. Bring it up into water that's maybe 4 feet deep if you're going to use a diffuser. So that's the way I see that. Well, good. Looks like we got some things chiming in here. It's scrolling past me, so let me back up here just a little bit. Okay, Kirk was talking about the owner of La Perla. I know him, and he's got his own issues down there. When you try to push the envelope pushes back, and he's had some issues with fish dying. As a matter of fact, he's been calling me and talking to me about it, and he's trying to come up with another game plan. But yes, he has used those Macrobrachium rosenbergi and saw some pretty good results with that. But he's also writing a big check. I mean, he might buy several thousand pounds of crawfish at a time. So he's over the years he's spent the money to try to grow a world record bass, and he's done it with the anticipation of growing that world record bass. He just hasn't figured out how to get over the hump yet. Jeremy Day, are you opposed to tires in ponds for structure? No, I'm not opposed to them. Old railroad ties, don't use those, because the creosote in those old railroad ties can give you some issues with your water. But I don't have any issues with tires. Now, let's talk about that. Jeremy is building a lake, got it pretty much built. Now he's doing his habitat plan. If you take tires and put them in, like in groups of 3, where you put one here, and one here, kind of like a little pyramid, and then you bundle those tires together to where there might be 4 or 5 or 6 of those units with 3 tires in it, then you can build like a reef. So bundling them is important. Now, another thing about tires is you got to let the air out, which that sounds kind of funny because there's no air in them until you put them in the water. There'll be bubbles of air in a tire. So it's a wise idea to drill a hole in them so that when you submerge them in the lake, or when the lake fills up, it's going to let the air escape. So no, I'm not opposed to tires at all. They're inert. I've heard guys that don't like them. I like them. With a new pond, when should you worry about adding aeration? Here's the way I see that. That's a good question. I'd say about year 2 or 3. And here's the way I see it. If you build a pond right, you built a dam in the basin of the lake, typically is where the material came to build the majority of the dam, typically. Not always true. Not always. Sometimes you got to go off-site to get the clay. I looked at a lake in Mississippi here a few months ago, and Ron Ardoin knows exactly which one I'm talking about, near Port Gibson, where they took all the clay to build the dam from adjacent to the lake basin and left all the trees standing in the basin of the lake. I am 100% opposed to that, because that's too much. And plus, that whole basin of the lake is packed full of organic matter and topsoil. So if you get rid of a bunch of the topsoil in the bottom of the lake, then you're going to minimize the risk of having organic matter that breaks down too quickly. So in this Mississippi lake, they should have started aerating that damn thing before it had water in it. But with a brand new pond where the majority of the bottom of the lake has been scraped out with no topsoil on it anymore, I'm going to tell you year 2 or 3. And the way you do that is start managing your water quality. Pay attention to that. Here's a real important tip. Buy a thermometer and start checking the temperature of the water. And as you check the temperature of the water, do it maybe 3 times a week. You can do it at the surface, 3 feet down, 6 feet down. Keep a log. It's not that hard. Put it in a notebook. Then put it once a month, put it on a spreadsheet in your computer. Not hard. And if you'll do that, start checking your temperature, you're going to start seeing that everything is related to that. And where I'm going now is, as the visibility of the water begins to decrease, you're going to want to measure the visibility. That's the 2 main things that you need to do with your water, is check the temperature of the water and check the visibility of the water. When you start to see the visibility changing, where the watercolor is pretty green and the visibility decreases to less than 18 inches, that's a sure sign that the water is doing what it can to process the nutrients, create the plankton blooms, algae blooms, that are ultimately going to be part of what causes water quality issues at some point. Now, in the South, we do want a good plankton bloom because that helps with the fishery. In the Midwest, less so. The North, don't even think about having a heavy-duty plankton bloom all year long. You don't want to do that. So, Jeremy Day, the answer to your question is about year 2 or 3. With a pond like you're building, probably year 3 would be a good time to look at that. And here's another hint. When you do get ready to buy an aeration system, work with a company that will size the system based on your lake. Now, most of the good companies will do that. If you want to go to pondboss.com, click on the resource guide, then you can find all those different companies that are in the aeration business and give them a call. We won't let them advertise unless they're reputable. So give them a call, check them out, and you can soon get some hints and some good data as to what kind of aeration system you need. Don't overdo it, but do not underdo it. Underdoing it is worse than overdoing it. If you overdo it, you can at least cut it back. If you underdo it, it's not going to help you, it's going to hurt you. So, there's my spin on aeration. Kirk says, when my father was young in the 50s, he fished with his grandfather on Lake Austin. They seined up minnows and fished for bass. The minnows that the bass overwhelmingly preferred were what he called Texas shad. He said they had a pink hue to them. I fish Central Texas lakes all the time and never see any minnows with a pink hue. What species do you think that was? I tell you, when I was reading that, I tell you what my gut was, is that if you're going to be fishing with shad, then any kind of shad, that means you're either going to catch them with a cast net or you're going to seine them up in the shallows. Well, when you seine them up, the first thing they do is they slough their slime and their blood comes to the surface of their skin. So actually, if you handle them too much, they'll start bleeding just from being handled. So my gut reaction is in the 50s, that's probably gizzard shad. Now, there are some minnows that are native to the rivers that are there, and the colloquial name is red horse minnows. But they don't really have a pink hue. They've got some red color in the fins and red right behind the head, but not so much. I think that's small gizzard shad. That's my gut reaction to that. So, I didn't fish in the 50s. Wasn't born yet. I was born in 55. Do the math. 67. How'd that happen so fast? 67? Gee. It's pretty funny. I don't know how many of you guys are a little gray around the beard like me, but when you're young, you're young, and then when you get old and you look in the mirror, you think, I'm not that old, because on the inside, you don't think it. It's really funny. I'm not even waxing philosophical there. Okay, question on pond freezing over in Southwest Virginia. We took our aeration out for the winter. An issue with the pond freezing over for a few inches. At best we could figure, we have about 120 gallons per minute flowing through from spring heads feeding the pond. In the summer, about 300 plus gallons per minute. Should we have any issues to be concerned about? Jay, I doubt it. The only issue I can think of that jumps right to mind is if that spring water isn't aerated. If it doesn't have oxygen levels in it, then it can be replacing water with oxygen in it. Now, the other thing is if your ice is a few inches thick and it's clear, then photosynthesis still happens in the daytime, so your pond's got the ability to produce oxygen. Now, another thing is how big is the pond? If it's 120 gallons a minute flowing through a half-acre pond, then I'd look at it differently than 120 gallons a minute flowing through a 10-acre lake. So, I don't want to throw questions back at you, but that would be my answer. I don't think you have issues unless the spring is submerged in the water and is cranking out water from an aquifer that has zero oxygen in it. That's the only concern I would have. Jeremy Day, also with a new pond, when do you start to worry about it not being clear enough? How long should you wait until deciding it's time to add alum or gypsum? Here's the way I see that. When a pond is built and it starts filling up with water, there's disturbed soils around it. The sooner you can vegetate those disturbed soils, the better. And actually, where you are, if you haven't seeded those disturbed soils, I'd do it. And I would even, wherever there's topsoil, get some ryegrass on it or some fescue or something. Down around Houston, your climate's mild enough that it'll grow for you right now. And so how long would you wait? I think I would wait until I know that the source is gone. Now, ponds get muddy for basically a handful of reasons. So let's just kind of drill down into that real quick. They get muddy because something's physically stirring the mud up. which in that case could be rainfall, could be cattle, could be catfish, could be gizzard shad. The other one is when the clay particles are lighter than the water molecules. So colloidal clay molecules can fill the water column, and they're too light to sink. So how long should you wait? I'd say once you've got that got the disturbed soils vegetated, if it's not starting to clear up by about 2 or 3 months after that, then you may want to give it a nudge. And it depends on which months those are. So if it fills up in the spring, I'd probably wait until the summer, but I'd go ahead and get the forage fish started. Once you have enough water to stock the bait fish, get that done. Whether it's muddy or not, doesn't matter, because you want to get a jump start on that fisheries before Mother Nature does it for you in ways you may not like. So, and then one thing you can also do is take a 1-gallon glass jar, and I like glass because you can see through it, and fill that jar up with the muddy pond water, set it on a shelf in the garage, and see if it clears up by itself. If it clears up by itself, then you have the hope that it will clear up when the pond finally gets settled and you get the vegetation stuff going. Clint Price says, thoughts on trying to establish eelgrass or water celery in an 8-acre pond in southern Illinois. I love that idea. The thing is, what you're probably going to have to do, if it's an 8-acre existing pond, then you're going to need to build some exclusion fences to keep turtles out, keep fish out, keep whatever you plant from being disturbed until it can take root and grow. Now, study about eelgrass and study about water celery. Study about those plants. See if there's others, like Illinois pondweed. I love that stuff. So you'll want to build an exclusion fence, plant it, see if it can grow, and then once it establishes, then you can take the fence down. Now, what's an exclusion fence? You can drive 4 to 6 T-posts in the ground and put 36-inch high chicken wire around it and shove it down in the mud so turtles can't go under it, because turtles will I'm sure root up your plants and eat them. Okay, so Drew Schmidt says, here in Kansas, like much of the country, we've been in a drought. Yep, my pond is down 5 to 6 feet. Most of my habitat is 6 feet or less. I'm going to think that's eating habits slow down, but should I be worried about predators feasting too much of the prey, and should I consider adding habitat deeper? Yeah, I'm going to tell you this. The predators are going to eat the prey, because when a pond draws down 5 or 6 feet and the fish are consolidated out and congregated outside of their habitat, then you're going to see more of a feeding frenzy. The good news is it's cold, so they're not as hungry and they're not moving as much. But yes, but now here's the second part of the question: is should you consider adding more habitat deeper? Yeah, I think you should. I think that's a good idea. Now, the real answer to that question is going to be, how long does it stay that low? So if you're in a drought for 18 months, it's totally different than being in a drought for 6. If you're in a drought for 6 months, it drops 5 or 6 feet. 8 months, fills back up, whole nother ball game than if it's a year and a half later. If the later the drought or the longer the drought lasts, the greater the odds are that the predator fish are going to decimate the forage fish. Now, here's what happens. Now, think about this. This will make great sense to you guys. When a pond draws down, I'm going to come at you from several different ways. The top 3 feet of most ponds is the same volume of water as the rest of the pond. Now, think about that a minute. That makes sense to you, especially if you got a 3-to-1 slope going down to the depth of whatever it is. In Kansas, if you're down 5 or 6 feet, you're probably down with over 60% of the water volume being down. So what happens then is the fish adjust, the population adjusts to the volume of the water and the size of the pond. So they will readjust to adapt to that habitat and that volume of water. And when the pond fills back up, then what you're going to see is the fish are going to spawn like crazy and repopulate that bigger body of water. So the answer is, don't be too worried about the predators unless your drought lasts too long. And yes, add more habitat. Let's take a minute. Hey, Pond Boss Magazine, guys. $35 a year, cheaper than a Friday night date, and it lasts a year. PondBoss.com. Subscribe. $35. You know, we also have a bunch of books and things for sale. Institute of Higher Pondology. Debbie reminded me today that when she found out that I was going to hop in and do this tonight, she said, you know what? Some of these guys over the winter may want to check out the Institute of Higher Pondology. If you want to check that out, you're going to pay for it, but you're also going to get what you pay for. One thing that I'm really proud of about the Institute of Higher Pondology, and I see Peyton Igo checking in here. He actually attended the last one in person, and he'll be the first one to tell you that it's going to help him save the dumb tax with whatever projects he works on and with his clients, because he's putting together a pretty good group of pond management clients to go along with his wildlife management stuff. So go to pondboss.teachable.com. And there's a link to it at the website at pondboss.com too. Purina Mills. You know, we're not feeding fish right now because it's a little too chilly, but we're getting around. I'll be talking with the Purina guys here in the next 10 days or so and checking with them. I love what they've done with their fish foods. Texas Hunter Feeders, our good friend Chris Blood, he emailed me here a few days ago, and he's taking a position, a little different position, moving up the food chain there at Texas Hunter. And there's going to be a new guy named Andy that's going to step in and help him take care of all the feeder stuff. So one of the things I love about Texas Hunter, not only are their feeders great, their customer service is too. And, man, I'll take that to the bank, and you take it to the bank. They're really, really good. Easy Doc, David Schneiderman, Easy Docs of Texas, also sponsors this show. HuntBirdDog.com. My son, Jonathan Lusk, with his running buddy, Taylor Jackson, have come up with a really cool niche business that's growing like crazy. Good to see Peyton. Let's see, John Dyer. Let me scroll down through here and see what we got. I have a small stock tank near Baird. Okay, that's over near Abilene in a fairly remote part of the ranch. I spend 100% of my time on the ponds that I can get to easy, but my hunters are always talking about the nice bass that they catch there. No known history of stocking, but someone did sometime. Suggestions other than buy an ATV so I can get to it. Yeah, bring somebody out with a bulldozer and carve a road to it there, brother. You know, if the guys are out hunting and they're carrying a rod around with them, something's going on. Yep, but I know exactly what you're talking about. I've got some clients near Baird. Matter of fact, Big O, Steve Parks, he's got a really nice ranch near Baird. He's been in the lure business for years. He's a black belt, just an all around stud guy. Jay Spires, an acre and a quarter. Okay. Three springs ahead of the pond that come down a ways. Okay, well, if those springs are ahead of the pond and they're coming down a rocky brook, that's an asset. That's a big asset. So I wouldn't do a thing about it, wouldn't worry about it. They're going to add oxygen. The temperatures are going to be mitigated by the time it hits the water. It's probably going to be cool. Greg Russell, North Louisiana, 2 questions. I quit feeding bluegills in December. When should I start back? Let's see, if you're in North Louisiana, second week of March. Start feeding them again. 4-acre pond stocked with tiger bass, copper-nosed brim, and added threadfin shad last year. Probably too many bass. Kept every bass under 14 inches and under. Should I fish it hard before the spawn and keep everything? No, don't fish it hard and keep everything. Fish it hard and selectively harvest the fish that don't fit your management strategy. So if you got a 4-acre pond, you may want to harvest through the course of a year 60 to 80 bass. But what you need to do, now every one of you guys needs to do this. Now listen to me. You need to weigh and measure as many bass as you can and compare those to the standard chart. So in other words, a 10-inch bass should weigh 10 ounces. 12-inch bass should weigh 12 ounces. 14-inch bass, 1 pound, 7 ounces. 16-inch bass, 2 1/4. 18-inch bass, 3 1/4. Now I know y'all wrote that down. But compare your bass to what they should weigh. What you'll typically see in a bass crowded pond is there'll be a certain size class of bass that are underweight. Now they got to be underweight because that size class ran out of food for that size mouth. Those are the fish you need to be harvesting. If you catch an 18-inch bass that looks like what Ray Scott used to say looks like an Alabama deputy sheriff, throw it back. It's making a good living. So selective harvest is the way to go with that. And plus, if you catch a bass that just knocked the fire out of your spinnerbait and gave you a great fight, and you look at it and it looks kind of average, throw it back. Because that fish is aggressive, even if it's a male. If the aggression is an inherited trait. One of the things I don't like about angling for harvest is you have a tendency to remove too many of the most aggressive fish, and then 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, if you've aggressively harvested like we tell you to, then odds are high that you're leaving behind the fish that are less aggressive to be able to reproduce, and then more fish that don't have that aggressive nature to hit a hook. So, Greg, selective harvest. John Pearson noticed several large freshwater mussels in a 1-acre pond. Any benefits or detriments to them being in a pond? Yeah, I love them. I love those things. When you find mussels, they're kind of like the canary in the coal mine. They're John Henry says we got 37 viewers. Well, now we got 36. Somebody dropped off. I know it's Wednesday. You got a lot to do. I love mussels, John, and the reason I like mussels is they're an indicator species. They can only live in healthy water, and they can only live where they have a food source. So what happens is that they live in the mud, and they filter detritus and organic matter from the mud. So they're kind of like nature's vacuum cleaner. And when they do their job, the population can get dense enough that they'll run out of food. And then typically when you have a population of anything that runs out of food, then what you see is some of them are going to die. So you'll see some mussel shells, especially this time of year, especially when ponds are dropping their levels, when the levels are dropping. But they're an absolute 100% benefit to a pond. If you don't have them and you can get some that are local and native, man, I'd add them to them. So I love mussels. Let's see what else we got here. It's already 7:12. This hour just flies by when we do this, boys. I didn't really come in with a topic. I had 3 things I was going to talk about. Yep, and I've hit 2 of them already. Let's see. Tim Deal, best for a fountain to be run 24/7, 12 to 18 hours a day, or not at all this time of year? Central North Carolina, 1-acre pond, average 6 feet deep. Just had an infusion of muddy water due to a heavy rain. Typically clears up in early spring. Here's my answer for that. My answer for that is when the air is dry, whether it's cold or hot or warm. If the air is dry, it's going to absorb much, much more water from your pond from a fountain than it will from like a bottom diffused aeration system. I see fountains more as aesthetically appealing, pretty, and it's in terms of how much to run them. I think that's a personal choice because they don't typically have an impact on the water quality. Now, if you've got a fountain that's drafting deep, which you may have, water on the vocal cord, when you have, if you have an aeration system a fountain that drafts deep, then they can be of some benefit for aeration. And I would only run it during the daytime because if you run it at night, it's going to help chill the water down even more. Jeremy Day, thanks for your help. Yeah, it's part of what I do, man. It's fun to do it. There's old Tyler Shaka Markley. What bourbon are you enjoying this evening? You know what? My wife poured it from the bottle into the thing, the little jar with the glass thing in it. You know what I think this is? I'm not a connoisseur, but I think it's Angel Envy. I think that's what it is. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that's what it is because that's what it tastes like. Even though I'm not a snob. I'm not a bourbon snob. Look at there. There's Chris Blood. I was hoping he'd check in. You know what? And God dang, Chris, you guys ought to shoot me because when I start thinking about Texas Hunter, it's so ingrained in me about the feeders that I completely forget about the dadgum Texas Angler products. And here's a link for it. Wait. Yeah, there. Yeah, right there. You guys go take a look at that after the show. And Chris, Chris, always appreciate the nudge, my friend. All right, clean line painting. Good to see clean line painting. I've never met anybody with a name like that. That's a pretty cool name. I don't want to talk to my parents about naming me Clean Line. Ask them what they were thinking. Let's see here. Let me make sure I'm not missing something. This bourbon is pretty smooth, though. Speaking of bourbon, Chris Blood gave me a great old-fashioned recipe, and to this day I still do it. He uses Clyde Mays bourbon with bitters, Luxardo cherries, a little bit of bar syrup, a splash of orange. He mixes that, and he likes to take these big balls of ice so it doesn't melt too fast, and bring all that together. It's a good sipper. It's a good sipper. Chris, we're going to do that again before long, dude. Okay, let me see what we got here. What temperature should I start fertilizing if my disc says so? About once the temperature is above 55 going up in the spring. That's the time to fertilize. And check your visibility. You know, now, the volume of fertilizer that you use is going to be based on the visibility. If your water clarity is 8 feet compared to 3 feet, you're going to use a different volume of fertilizer. And one thing to always remember about fertilization is the plankton bloom typically only grows in the top 3 or 4 feet of the water anyway. So you want to be able to mix that fertilizer really, really well into the water column. It needs to be dissolved in the water column in order to stimulate a plankton bloom. So that's a conversation we can have next spring, but that's a good tip for now. Do you know anybody in Houston that sells those freshwater shrimp? There's nobody in Houston that I know of that sells those freshwater shrimp. If you want to buy those Australian shrimp, then I can help you with that. But I have not met anybody yet that will go out in seine ditches and creeks and find those shrimp and then figure out how to reproduce them and sell them. You know what's really interesting? When I'm out shocking lakes, they're either there or they're not. And typically they get there from a local watershed. So, you know, as much as I love them, I don't know anybody that raises them. Timothy Chestnut, is that the same as a slot harvest? Yes, it is. It absolutely is. That's right. Richard Williams, hey Bob, pond is doing great, but should I not be feeding now? South Louisiana. Yes, you should be feeding now in South Louisiana. Heck, it's 85 degrees in Granbury. I can't imagine what it was in South Louisiana. When should I stock bass? I stock brim and minnows around July. Stock bass around the end of May. From the end of May until the 1st of July. That's the time to do that. Philip Benefield. I have a film. I'm on my 1.5 acre pond in Midwest Georgia for about the last 2 or 3 weeks. Oil-like, but not oil color. I read something about something called biofilm caused by decaying organic matter. Is that a thing or just someone trying to sell a product? That's a great question. A great question. The answer is that very well could be biofilm. Now, what happens this time of year, it's, you know, over the course, especially in Midwest Georgia, because your climate, you know, along the Atlantic seaboard plus being in the southeast, you're very likely to have some bacterial colonies paraphyting that can give off biofilm. So if you've got aquatic plants, for example, that have leaves on it, like American pondweed or Illinois pondweed or leafy pondweed, any of the pondweeds that have leaves on it, biofilm will actually grow on those leaves. Or they'll grow on substrates like rock or even sand sometimes. Well, when that stuff goes through its life cycle and the water temperature drops, that stuff dies and breaks loose, and there's some little bitty organic oil particles, which all oil is organic, by the way. Those organic oil particles can break loose from the cells and temporarily coat the top with an oily looking substance. Now the other thing that it can be, it's called whiting. So if you've got high alkalinity in your pond, and then at the end of the day, this typically happens more in the summertime because we have longer periods of sunlight in the summer than we do now, you can see the pond begin to kind of get a shade of a white color. And that's due in part to photosynthesis. So the answer to your question is biofilm is a thing. It's not just somebody wanting to sell you a product to clear it up. It is a thing. Look at there, Daniel Joseph Thompson starting the Chris Blood fan club right here at Pond Boss. Let me see here. Look at there's Travis Smith checking in. Good to see Travis. Never know where he is. All right, let's see. Shockham says, "Yum." That sound, yeah, it's a real good old fashioned. It was the very first one I ever had, and it's still my go-to. And Chris Blood did that. Okay, Nell St. Julian, you mentioned freshwater mussels. Do you know of anyone who sells native mussels for ponds? I don't know of anybody that does that, and if they do, I'd be skittish. Don't buy any from out of state. You want only species that are local to your part of the country. You know, so what I've done, when I was really active in managing ponds and lakes, if I came across a pond that had abundant mussels, and I knew it, and I had a client, less than about 30 or 40 miles away, and knew that region was such where those mussels were native, I'd hijack some and go take them over there and stock them for them. But I don't know of anybody that sells those things. And also, some of them are protected. So you really need to kind of dig down into that, so to speak, before you start moving any of them around. I might have to get a refill. That was only 2 fingers. Ryan Clark, good evening. I want to drain the pond for some dredging work. Should I do this now or wait till spring? Is there a temperature that's better than another, draining 50% of the pond? That is a really, really tough question. Every site's totally different. Here's the way I'm going to tell you. Summer before last, there was a fishing club that decided they wanted to drain their lake and dig a bunch of dirt out. So they said, let's do that in summer. So they drained the water off of that lake, and it was a big lake. They drained the water off like at the end of April. And then, I swear, every other week in that summer of 2021, it rained. And the cost skyrocketed because of the type of equipment that it took and what was needed to be able to move that wet muck. So now, I guess, Ryan, what you need to do is visit with an earth mover about your situation. Is there a water temperature that's better than... No, really, it's not about the temperature of the water. It's as much about keeping the water off the dirt long enough to be able to move it. Now, dredging, you can do that with water in it. If you want to drain it, then you're going to be using some heavy equipment to come in and dig it out. So I would be kind of digging around, learning about that with the different contractors. As a matter of fact, if you'll go to pondboss.com in the resource guide and check out earth movers and dredging companies, and I'd call them. Now, if you're working with a contractor,